What's good, people? Attorney John Mobley here. Well, at this point, disgraced, disbarred attorney Alex Murdaugh, also an all-around human cockroach, has pled guilty to the last of his criminal charges in the state of South Carolina. Those are the financial crimes for which he received a 27-year sentence. However, he also pled guilty to financial crimes in federal court for which he is yet to be sentenced, and he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences for the murder of his son and his wife. So the question is, how much time will Alex Murdaugh actually serve in prison? Well, in order to tell you that, you need a lawyer that understands sentencing in South Carolina State Court, federal court, and probably a mathematician. So let's do a legal deep dive into how much prison time Alex Murdaugh will actually serve. Okay, so let's talk about the crimes Murdaugh pled to in state court. Initially, he was charged with over 100 financial crimes for offenses ranging from money laundering, fraud, involving multiple clients across multiple counties. With this plea agreement, he was allowed to plead to 22 charges for a negotiated sentence of 27 years. Let's talk about what a negotiated sentence means. And there are different types of plea agreements, but with a negotiated sentence, that means the prosecution, the defense attorneys, and of course the defendant agree that upon pleading guilty, the defendant will serve a specific number of years. That's called the negotiated sentence. In Murdaugh's case, it was 27 years. Now, in addition to that, the state of South Carolina has sentencing guidelines which determine how much of a sentence an inmate or defendant must serve before he can be released. That number or that percentage changes from 1/4 to 1/3 to 2/3 to 85% to day for day. For the charges to which he pled guilty, Murdaugh will be required to serve 85% of that 27-year sentence. That means about 22 years. So since he's 55 years old, he'll be close to 80 years old before he can be released on parole. Now back to sentencing. Now Murdaugh has already pled guilty to federal financial crimes in federal court. Money laundering, wire fraud, bank fraud, and he's yet to be sentenced. Now, sentencing in federal court is different than state court. Now I'm going to give you my estimate, but I want you to understand it is just an estimate because it's actually a very convoluted process. The process involves a calculation, application of something called the federal sentencing guidelines, which are mandatory in federal court. They're applied by an independent federal agency, the Department of Justice, and Murdaugh's attorney. And what happens is everyone gets together and decides or forms an opinion regarding how the guidelines apply to a particular case, and they present and argue to a judge who hears from all of them and then decides what he thinks is the appropriate guideline sentence. Again, very convoluted, and for lawyers that don't practice criminal offense in federal court regularly, it can be overwhelming. However, I looked at the guidelines. Based on the amount of money that he stole, I'm thinking Murdaugh's going to serve right around a 10-year sentence in federal court. And I got to call it like I see it. That does seem like a slap on the wrist. And honestly, on top of that, as part of the plea agreement, again, another plea agreement, they're allowing the time to run concurrent with the state sentence. Now, let's talk about what concurrent means. What that means is, instead of Murdaugh serving his state sentence and then once that's over, serving his federal sentence, he's serving the federal sentence at the same time he serves the state sentence, which means he's not serving any additional time for the federal crimes, which kind of blows my mind. It kind of makes you wonder. I mean, number one, why bother? You know, number two, just like in state court, why even give him a plea agreement? The guy had absolutely no defense. They did not have to agree to concurrent time on those charges, but that's the decision they made, and we all have to live with it. Let's talk about Alex Murdaugh's murder conviction and life sentences. Now, after being convicted of the murder of his wife and son, Murdaugh was given 2 consecutive life sentences for the murders. Now let's talk about that. And first, I want to talk about murder a little bit in South Carolina. A lot of times you watch TV, you hear about first-degree murder, second-degree murder. In South Carolina, it doesn't work that way. There's only murder. There are no different degrees, only the crime of murder. The minimum penalty for murder in South Carolina is 30 years, and the maximum penalty is life in prison. Now, you heard me talk about different sentencing guidelines in South Carolina, 1 1/4, 1/3, 2/3, etc. Well, for murder, it is day for day. If a person receives a 30-year sentence, it is every day of that 30 years. If a person receives a life sentence, that is every day of their life, and you don't leave prison until you're in a box. The 2 life sentences Murdaugh was given for the murders were made consecutive by the trial judge. Now, consecutive means the sentences are served back to back, which means once you serve one sentence, then you start serving the next, as opposed to concurrent, which means they're being served at the exact same time. So what that means is Murdaugh would have to serve 1 life sentence, die in prison, and then start serving his next life sentence, which means he's never getting out of prison. Well, I gotta call it like I see it. The only sentences I think were appropriate in these cases are the ones for the murder. The sentences for the financial crimes were a joke. Well, you might be thinking, the prosecutor said they're saving the victims of the financial crimes of having to testify in court. I disagree. Those victims would have loved to have the day in court. They would have loved to testify about what he did to them, how this affected them in front of the world. You also might be thinking, well, he got the life sentences for murder. Doesn't really matter. However, right now, there's a motion for a new trial based on juror misconduct, which is legitimate. There's also an appeal and a potential post-conviction relief, both of which could get his conviction overturned in a new trial. We'll talk about that more on my next episode. That's it. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. There's so many topics to talk about. I appreciate you taking the time to join me on this legal deep dive, but please subscribe, leave me your comments, and tell me the legal issues you want to talk about. You can find me on YouTube, social media, and your favorite podcast platform. Until then, that's it.